Good afternoon or good evening, wherever you listen to us from here on this big, beautiful planet we call Earth. This is Michael Cross here with another edition of Unlock the Door Radio here on UCY TV Productions, where we dare to ask the questions that the mainstream media usually doesn't. I mean, they figure that you're too busy chasing after consumer goods that they try to sell you. In fact, that seems to be the whole meaning of life, according to the mainstream media. But hey, you got to give them credit. After all, that's how they make their money. If it wasn't for you, they wouldn't be driving around their fancy cars and living in their mansions in Southern California. Now, would they? No. So just keep buying and buying and buying and sacrificing family and spiritual aspirations in order to be a good consumer. Anyway, of course, I'm being ironic there. I'm going to deal with something very, very close to this in a moment. I would like just to take a little copy of our media industry, and that is a plug or a product placement within the broadcast. I would encourage people, if you really enjoy dystopian style science fiction, thriller, fantasy, whatever you want to call it, a new novel, The Destiny of Our Past. Yes, The Destiny of Our Past. I know it sounds like a weird name, but look it up and you'll see why it is named the way it is. You can check that on Amazon, The Destiny of Our Past. And also, if you're listening to this on YouTube later, subscribe to the station and then you keep up on future shows. Anyway, enough said. Now, what I would like to deal with is the idea that I was asked by a young woman the other day if I believed in free will. And I thought about that. That's a complex question. Of course, I do believe in free will. Limitations on it. Let me explain why. I would say that free will exists within the parameters of major choices, and then all the minor choices come in pretty much made for you based on that. I know it sounds complicated, but let me first just kind of deal with the major psychological thinkers of the 20th century, those being B.F. Skinner and Sigmund Freud. Now, Freud believed that things were pretty much as a child. So your choices are based on the major events that took place in your life for, let's say, the age of 6, in which even your choice of marriage partner will be based on your opposite sex parent, be that good or bad. It imprints on you. Just like, that study, I forget the guy's name. Was it Conrad Lorenz? I forget. Anyway, there was a guy who did an experiment in which he wrote about it. I mean, I think farmers have known about this for centuries. He raised a bunch of geese out, and they imprinted immediately that he was the mother. And they followed him everywhere as if they were part of his family. Now, you can see this with dogs, too, that they imprint. When you get them as a puppy, it doesn't take them long to suddenly think, well, I'm a member of the pack or family. And they'll be so loyal to you that they would sacrifice their own safety to protect you. And Freud believed pretty much the same way. Now, that doesn't mean that he didn't believe that there was choices that you could make, but he would believe that most of it's already kind of created, kind of a hard drive. I mean, if your hard drive isn't compatible with a program that you're trying to install, you can't install it. So therefore, that was Freud's view. So in other words, preferences and things, neurosis could be exercised, but you would have to actually go through therapy for that. And it's a long and difficult process. Although I will have to say, though, modern research tends to show that the psychoanalytic method actually works better than other methods in getting people to feel well. Anyway, The other thinker was B.F. Skinner, and he was a behaviorist, and he believed that everything was based on shaping. So you're just basically a bundle of your synapses. That's been programmed by your experiences. So who you are is based on education. Your ego is merely the human organism that you are interacting within the environment. And of course, that means that you're going to want to have pleasure other than pain. So therefore, you will choose the more pleasurable experience when you are offered choice. But it's not really a choice now, is it? He did a book called Beyond Freedom and Dignity that if you want to get an insight into modern behaviorism, then that's a pretty good place to go. It was a play on Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil, which is kind of ironic since it seemed that Skinner was not a fan of philosophy. Okay, everything was just science. Although I would say that his methods and his approach, they looked like science, but they weren't really any more scientific than Freud's were or any other psychological thinker. And but still, Freud and Jung believed in a certain level of determinism. So Skinner believed you take 10 kids, let's say you took 10 cloned kids. They're all genetically identical, and you put them in 10 different environments. You can make them into 10 totally different types of people in all respects. The irony to that, though, is that modern studies on siblings who've been adopted, especially twins who've been separated early on, tends to show that there's a lot of stuff that's in us. Okay? It's too many coincidences to just be random, and therefore there is perhaps a genetic component. You can even say there's a spiritual component. All right, if you want to go into the realms of pre-existence, and maybe people come through families that are meant to come through certain families. So therefore, if you adopt them out, well, they're still people that in a prior existence, and I mean that not in the reincarnation sense, but the spiritual sense, would be compatible. And therefore, if you separate them, they come back together 20, 30 years later, and they find out that they are very much alike. Now, of course, geneticists who didn't go for that would just say, well, our genes make us who we are. Now, all of these, except for the spiritual one, the genetic, Freudian, the Skinner, kind of get down on the idea then that there's such a thing as free choice. Freud's going to say the kind of woman you marry if you're a guy is going to be one that reminds you of his mom. Vice versa. The woman will go for her dad. Skinner would just say, well, no, it's going to be based on factors such as, well, was your mother or father nice to you? But then what does the society say? And what kind of people have you interacted with that have been nice to you will determine what kind of man or woman you're attracted to. Now, keeping that in mind, I want to use an analogy here that I think really describes the concept of free will quite well. And that is this. I do believe in free will. Okay? I do believe we have choices. But let's pretend this. You've got a choice. Let's say you're living in America and you want to visit London. Oh, I know London's a pretty violent place to visit, but hey, go there during the daytime. So if you want to go see Big Ben and Buckingham Palace and all that kind of fun stuff. So anyway, let's say you have a choice. You can take a boat or you can fly. See, you don't have other choices. You can't take a train. You certainly can't walk. So, those are the two best methods to get to London from, let's say, Miami, Florida. Now, you do have the choice. And you can make that choice based on your prior experiences, your likes and dislikes, how much time you have, and so forth. But you still have that choice. Now, here's the thing, though. once you go through the boarding gate and get onto that airplane and it takes off, or once you get on the boat and they pull the ramp and it takes off, your choice has now been made in reference to the trip. You can't suddenly change your mind when you're out in the middle of the ocean or flying over the middle of the ocean. Oh, I think I want to take a boat. How do I organize that? No, you can't do that. Your choices now are going to be based on such things as if you're on the airplane, what kind of seat you bought. Was it in first class or was it in crunch class? Was it, what kind of foods did you order? Preferences. What kind of things did you take with you to do while on the flight? Those kinds of things. Those are your choices now. But they have been determined on that airplane. The other choices, if you're on the boat, will be such things as, going out, walking around the deck. That's an advantage you don't really have on an airplane. And doing things like that. But again, you can't suddenly teleport yourself onto an airplane if you decide, well, I really am being bored of this and I want to be on a flight. So your choices ultimately are based on the idea that you make the choice and then you live with it. But after that, a lot of choices are made for you. When you're on the airplane, you're not the one flying, so you don't have a choice of speeding the plane up, turning it around, or doing those kinds of things. If you're on the boat, the same goes there. So your choices are limited within the confines of those choices. But you still had that free will as to whether you wanted to take the airplane or be on the boat. Now, I brought up religion earlier when it comes to choices. Based on the idea of maybe there's a pre-existence, and then you separate a brother and a sister, and they rediscover each other 20 years later, whether it was an open adoption or some sort of DNA testing or something like that. By the way, a lot of siblings are meeting each other. It's kind of interesting. That it is kind of funny that take a DNA test. And then it says that you have someone who shares about half of your DNA in a totally different town. And you're like, what? And then would it be half? Yeah. Oh, well, anyway, the idea would be then that maybe your dad wasn't telling you everything, or maybe not telling your mom everything. But still, people meet each other. And they often find that they have, they have the same preferences. They've dated the same kind of people. They've chosen the same sort of professions, and these kinds of things. So even if it's totally different environments, in fact, if radically different environments, you find that there's such a small variation on IQ that ultimately environment does not have a huge factor on basic intelligence. It has an aptitudes. It has a factor on your choices and opportunities, but not your abilities to be able to do this or that, or your inability to do this or that. But anyway, a lot of people talk about religion being a brainwashing thing. How dare you raise a child and tell him or her that this is the way life is. This is the way things are. Here's your version of God or gods, and so forth. Well, I would say this. First of all, I think that in a society such as the United States or many other Western-style democracies, you have to be willing to allow people individual freedom. And we also have to respect the rights of parents. If they want to raise their children, be it Jewish, Muslim, Christian, or Hindu or whatever, then there is that right to do so. Now, that challenges some people. That does. And they think, this is brainwashing. I would say this. Your child needs to be raised by someone, okay? If you took a child and just raised it without any kind of guidance, which again could be brainwashing from adults, then it would be a feral child and wouldn't learn anything. You know, these kids that are like abandoned in the woods and they don't learn how to talk and they basically act like animals because they have not interacted with humans. So, no, someone's going to raise a child. Now, it's going to be religion, people that have a religious base, or at least it's going to be society. If you say, I'm never going to speak about religion, ever, to my child, well, what's going to happen is that child will learn right and wrong from watching you. Now, I've known people who've, kind of new agey people who've said, I'm not going to teach my kids any morality. They're just going to learn it on their own. Well, they still are watching you, and they're getting an imprint. But those people I've known who've really completely gone against teaching their kids morality, well, their kids never really turned out so well because, A, they probably had a sense that, I guess mom and dad don't really care since they're not teaching me anything. So there must be a reason that they're not taking the time or the care to do that. Or B, they're just kind of like bouncing around like a ball in a pinball machine. So ultimately someone's going to raise a child. The child's first few years are very, very vital. If you go by Bandura's social learning theory, you learn right and wrong from what seems to be modeled around you. And I don't think that really goes against Freud or Skinner. In fact, it seems to be kind of a blend of the two. But the kid's going to be watching TV, if nothing else, and learning from that. Now you're thinking, okay, well, this proves that there's no such thing as free will. No, the child can still make choices, but it's going to be based on what they know or don't know and the values that they've been given. Now, religiously, if you teach a child that it's wrong to drink alcohol, then they're going to be predisposed to avoiding alcohol when it's offered to them. If you teach a child that it's perfectly okay and wonderful to drink alcohol, then they're going to be far more likely to use it. That's just the way it is. If you raise a child in a nudist colony, they're going to have no problems taking their clothes off in front of other people. If you raise them in a very, very strict home, that's not going to be the case. All right. It's just that, there's a lot of things that go into the build-up for the choices that we do make. And still, though, I think that the human brain is designed in such a way that it can, for no better term, fantasize about what happens if I do this or I do that. And that is choice. Okay? And ultimately, humans all have this choice. Now, I know this goes against this kind of sociology idea that we're all just the products of our society. See, I think that kind of takes the blame off of people when they do horrible things. Well, he or she was just raised a certain way. Society failed them. Now, society really does not fail someone because there's people that are raised in horrific situations and turn out to be wonderful. There are people raised in wonderful situations and turn out to be serial killers. So ultimately, it could have a bearing. I said the serial killers. There could be a situation in which most serial killers may have been deprived as children or abused and that sort of thing. But it's still, there was that choice before the first person they killed, whether they should do it or not. And then once they did it, then they became desensitized. It became easier and easier and easier. And they started deriving some sort of sick pleasure from it. But again, that was still their choice. Society did not mold them to do it. All right. Now, of course, societies, when we talk about culture, I almost said cult because that would be a Freudian slip, because essentially cult and culture mean the same thing. It's just culture we assume is a much bigger, more socially acceptable thing. You know, it's like with religion. If you've got a group of 50 people who believe a certain way, they're a cult. If you've got 500 million people who believe a certain way, they're a religion. If the group of 50 turns into 500 million someday, they're going to be seen as a religion, regardless of what their views are. So cult and culture mean the same thing. But when you have children raised, let's say, in Mississippi, they're going to be far different than a child raised in Poland. And a child in Poland is going to be far different than one raised in Kazakhstan. So therefore, there are restraints, there are teachings that say you should do this, you shouldn't do that, you should behave this way, you should not behave that way. Again, though, how many times do we see people who are raised with certain aspects to their society that they turn against? Let's say you're raised in a Muslim home in Kazakhstan, and yet you start drinking alcohol on the side. Well, you were told all your life it was wrong, but you still do it. And then usually you find other people who are doing the same thing, which gives you a certain reinforcement. Again, though, you had the choice to do it or not to do it. Alfred Adler did say, the day you decide to do something different in your life is the day you've created change. So yes, a person who's alcoholic, that was raised not to use alcohol, they can still go back and stop doing that. A person who was raised in a very devout Catholic home in Poland can turn into an atheist. And then, of course, that's going to determine the kind of people they're around and what kind of reinforcements they will receive and so forth. But they still could, if they chose to, go back to Catholicism, of which many do. You saw that when communism fell in Eastern Europe. Oh my gosh, tons of people who were atheists went back to church. The person in Mississippi, they could become, even though they were raised very conservative, they might wind up becoming really, a very liberal vegan activist. Okay? But that was their choice to do that. And the fact that you do find people that do this, demonstrates that there is choice. And of course, if they chose to, they could go back. But what I said about reinforcement's very, very powerful. If you do change, then you go into something totally new. Let's say you join something really bizarre. Let's say you join a vampire cult. I'm not talking about the real thing, the Count Dracula or metaphysical creatures like you would see on Twilight or True Blood or any number of vampire series. But I'm talking about people who have, they go and they drink blood and they dress in black and, kind of pretend to be vampires. Well, now, if you join a group like that, again, your reinforcement is based on hanging out with the other people. Now, you don't go in there and start becoming really radical, different than everyone. You go in there, dressed in all white or something, because you're going to be seen as an outsider still. And actually, joining smaller groups creates more conformity, because the more isolated and insular a group is, the more you will conform or you will be seen as a threat, and you'll be either defriended or outright kicked out. And so that's a very important concept to keep in mind. When it comes to choice, though, in society, I would say that, like Edward Bernays said, that many of the things that we do are from sources that we have no idea about. The fact that you wear your hair the way you do right now. If you were born, many of you were living in the 1970s, and I'll bet your hair looked a lot different. I mean, in the sense of style. Maybe some of you are listening and, you're bald now, and you weren't in 1979. But styles and trends are very, very, very important. The rock music brought in the idea of, to a large degree, the leather trench coat and leather accessories and stuff like that. Most people don't know, they've not looked into where that came from. Most people have no idea where manners came in. Why don't you use your fingers to eat this food, but if you use a fork to eat that, this food here, people are going to laugh at you. That sort of thing. So in other words, if you eat, for instance, if you're living in Sweden and you pick up a piece of chicken with your fingers, people look at you a little funny because they've been raised to believe that you eat chicken, believe it or not, seriously, I'm not joking, with a fork and knife. So you cut off a leg of chicken and you eat it with a fork and knife. Of course, that leaves a lot of chicken that goes to waste, which I think is a real waste. And it's not very nice to the fact that a chicken gave its life for your meal and then you're throwing perfectly good meat in the garbage can. But in America, if you started using a fork and knife, people would look at you funny and start laughing. And believe me, if you were a presidential candidate and you started even eating pizza with a fork, people are going to laugh at you. But especially a fork and knife for a leg of chicken, people are going to think something's wrong. But that's part of our culture. The thing is, you still, when you sit down, you've not been so programmed not to think about it. Or should I go back to that? Fantasize. The mere fact that you can think about all of your alternatives means that you do have alternatives. You could do something different. Even though Bernays said that our fashions and so forth come from Hollywood, he was one of the ones that started that, by the way. Later, television and so forth. Our values can come across TV. You still have a choice. So even though you may grow up on TV and they show you all of these kinds of ways to live, you may choose something totally different, although it is more difficult. When you're faced with a choice, you still have this kind of sense of conformity because we are hardwired to conform. I mentioned this in a show recently. Human beings have a sense of wanting to belong. Our biochemistry gets affected if we go against the group. Again, you can go to the Asch experiments, in which a person comes in, doesn't know that everyone in the class is in on this, so they're going to say that this one line is the same length as another line, even though it's very apparent that it is not. But he or she may still say it is because they don't want to go against the group. It feels difficult to do so. Nietzsche said being yourself means you're going against the tribe and it's going to hurt, but it's worth the price you pay. The thing is that if you study the biochemistry, because a lot of people just think, okay, well, the person just didn't want to say something out loud and therefore be embarrassed. But if you check the biochemistry of that person, there's going to be a disruption in it to where the same kinds of hormones and chemicals that get released when you are doing something wrong are released when you go against the group, even though what you're doing is right. So if they say 2 + 2 = 5, and you say, no, it doesn't, it's 4, your brain is still reacting as if you're doing something wrong if you're going against the group. Okay? Now again, someone could say, well, see, that proves there's no such thing as free will. Even your brain chemistry wants you to do what the group is doing, even though it's wrong. So sure, if you get into a big group situation where they're doing something horrendously wrong, looting or something like that, there is that sense of false ego projection in which you cease to be an individual, you become part of the group. But there's still that part of you that says, should I be doing this? All right? And ultimately, it is difficult to go against that, your values. But it is easier if everyone else is doing it. But there is still that choice. There's lots of times when people are looting that other people just kind of turn around and walk away. They don't stay part of it, or they may be making lots of noise and even sharing, but on the inside they're going, no, I'm not going to do that. I don't think that's right. So ultimately, then, I think we do have free will. And I think free will is something that we really, really need to hold on to. Because a lot of the people that kind of run our society believe that humans are pliable. They're work units, human resources. Come on, you can read a lot of the stuff that's put out by think tanks and people in positions of power, social change agents, and they see humans as being pretty much clay to be formed one way or another. Kind of like, a lot of them do get into B.F. Skinner. That's why B.F. Skinner got, so much support from government type people. The idea that, hey, we can make people what we want them to be. Well, the thing is that it doesn't work all the time because there's always a person who stands out and doesn't do it. Now, they may be an exception, but they're an important exception. And when someone is an exception, it causes other people to have doubts too. I think that's why, for instance, I brought this up before, a lot of newspapers that are online, just like 2 years ago, it seemed that almost all of them, I may be wrong about this, but just, surfing the internet, I found that almost all of them had a discussion section where you could go down and comment on the stories. But then there's been research that has shown that if you show dissent, let's say a guy could be a Pulitzer Prize winner and writes this really long and in-depth article, and then someone in the comment section says, well, this is rubbish, this is not right. You realize what that does? It actually causes the rest of the readers, when they see that, to question. And it really, really devastates the acceptance that takes place if you just present the article alone. So therefore, I think a lot of newspapers have taken down their comment section because they realize that it just takes a few people to get in there and just really question one point or all the points in an article, and all of a sudden it turns opposite of what that newspaper may have wanted to convey to the public in order, and so they get rid of it. I see this as a trend in social media in which social media giants are going to try cutting back more because they're not really, they support choice as long as you're choosing the choices that they want you to choose. Okay? And that's the extent that it goes, which is really, really disheartening because the whole idea of the internet was, after it kind of got out there into the public sphere, was that people would be able to be free to discuss and comment and so forth. And there's people out there. I think the people that talk about fake news are the same kind of people that talk about pornography. And what I mean by that is a lot of times the people that are actually condemning pornography the most have a taste for pornography. They're looking at pornography as much as the average person, but they condemn it because they're like, what if other people that are looking at this stuff are caused to start doing bad things and so forth? Because I'm thinking about, this would be fun to do here and here and here. Well, do we really want the average person to feel this way too, or to get ideas from it? So they come out vehemently against pornography. And I think the same is true of the people who are saying that, oh, there's fake news out there, we can't have that. And often it's not fake. It's just questioning the actual narrative that seems to be being pushed. Because I've seen articles of experts that are phenomenal, and yet it's just labeled by someone, oh, this is fake news. And you're going, what? I've been to events in which someone will say this happened, and I know it happened, but then when someone reports it, someone will just say this is fake, it can't be true. And so I think that those could just be, holes or something like that. But ultimately, the people that have the power now in social media believe that if we do give over power to the people to discuss issues in a totally open and democratic manner, you might wind up with results that you don't want because they might do this and this and this. And therefore, we better make sure they don't do this, this, and this, and we limit their choices. All in the name of democracy, of course. But, of course, that's like the person that wants to ban, and I shouldn't just narrow it down to pornography, that maybe they want to ban certain types of speech. They're just doing it to preserve the social order. So, it doesn't mean that I'm saying that, there's not things that you can find objectionable out there on the internet. But if you believe that humans are just driven by basically, a Skinnerian way of, stimulus response and so forth, and are pretty pliable in that sense, then you might feel like, well, too much freedom's not a good thing unless it's limited and supervised freedom, which of course is not freedom. If you're Hobbesian, like Freud was, he believed in freedom, but he also was scared of it in the sense that people might go back to their primitive instincts, then I suppose there may be some things you would want banned as well. But if you're into the idea that human beings can be trusted by and large, most of them, and that humans are good and humans can make choices in a rational manner if given all the facts, then you're going to be against internet censorship or any other kind of censorship for that matter, because you're going to realize that most people will behave in a pretty civilized way. And actually, most people in the world do, regardless of their country or religion or ethnicity. Most people are pretty nice people, all right? And it's usually the kind of people who don't believe in freedom of choice that will try to use their influence to make them do bad things. But it is, you could note that most of the time when people who have done atrocities are later interviewed, and I'm not talking about the big, general who ran some sort of death squad or something, but the underlings who were commanded to do atrocities will often break down because the guilt still hits them. Okay, that seems to be a feature that most people have, is a guilt if they do bad things to people. So overall, I would say, yes, we do have free will, we do have free choice, but often our choices are limited by the choices that we make prior. Okay? That's the distinction I would make. You go on that boat, you go on the airplane, now your choices are limited to the environment that you've now put yourself into. All right? Your mind can still go anywhere. On the boat, you might be fantasizing about, if you were visiting Hollywood. On the plane, you could also be fantasizing about that, even though you're over the Atlantic and you're heading to London. But still, that is a choice. And so humans are well beyond that idea that they're just biological robots, like Skinner seemed to believe in quite heavily. So ultimately, I think that's a very positive way of looking at humanity. And I think ultimately that it is the correct way to look at humanity.
I just have to bring something up here that really, really kind of flattened me yesterday. And that is, I had made a post in one of the social media sites, and I just, was critical, not mean, just saying that the lady that did that comedy sketch at the White House Correspondents' Dinner that it really was not a very nice presentation. I personally didn't find it funny or anything, but I just said that without going into any kind of horrible details or anything. And then a debate started, and this lady who's in my network, I have people of all political persuasions there, just, responded like, oh my gosh, it was really great, I loved it, and all this. And in another thread related to this, actually, she had said that, that Sarah Huckabee was a liar and she deserved all this, that, and whatever. And then this debate it wasn't even really a debate, because, there's like a couple people who were more conservative that came in and they were critical. And this really set this person off. And, to the point of being really mean and vindictive. And it just got me thinking that, because I actually came in, I have to say this, I went on and said, look, I think if you had a group of people that were, let's say, Trump supporters, and a group of people who were Hillary supporters in the last election, just typical people, okay? Not campaign type people, but just typical people that you might find in a neighborhood. And you had a picnic that most of them would just get along and have a good time, and there'd be no problems. I mean, yeah, there'd be some political, maybe, discussions and disagreements, but for the most part, there wouldn't really be any confrontations. Okay? But then, she kind of unloaded on me there, and I was like, whoa, what is this all about? And I said, if we don't try to get political discourse to come together in some way and work on our mutual concerns. Because you see, I think actually quite a few people, even if they vote one way or another, still have the same concerns and could communicate and maybe work towards solutions. I could see things like maybe trying things like, instead of buying stuff from corporations, work together to create networks where you try to get your food locally grown and or products locally made. I've heard many conservative people say that they would love to do that, and I've also heard many liberal people say that they would love to do that. Who benefits if these people aren't getting together and organizing something? Because someone's going to set someone off, and pretty soon it's just going to disintegrate. Okay? I would tend to think that the large corporation that likes to have, all the meat grown on factory farms and all the food grown on these like factory farms as well, where everything's like a clone of everything else, I would tend to think that would be the entities that would like us all fighting against each other. And yet, where I have encountered some people on the right who are really nasty towards people on the left, I find that there's more people on the left who really take the last election really personal and are, to the point of, I've seen people repost Twitter posts, which for some, it's kind of interesting how those kinds of people that post these things don't get banned from Twitter when they make comments about, well, even beyond just, urging bodily harm to people they disagree with politically. But yet those are left up. Kind of strange, isn't it? But the thing is that I guarantee you, if this does not change, I know there's some people on the left that are like, yeah, bring the revolution, man. And they have these images of the the Russian, well, actually, they were all actually, they're not real. The film footage of the storming of the Winter Palace or whatever it was in 1917, those were all filmed by a production crew later, after the fact, to make it look more dramatic, but I think they have those kinds of images in their minds. But I will guarantee you that that's not what it would look like. I mean, a civil war in the United States would not be pretty, and I think that ultimately the urban areas would not fare very well. The areas that have most of your concentration of people that, for instance, would have voted for Hillary. And no one wants that. I hope no one wants that, really. But I'll say this: if you want something that'll give you a picture of what what the country would look like if you had such a situation, a social breakdown, which if people don't get their acts together a little bit and try communicating rather than just being mean, you would be saying hello to people, you won't be saying, hello to people like Hillary or Trump or anything like that. You're going to be, if you're familiar with The Walking Dead, it's going to be people like the governor, and I can't remember the guy that was the head of the cannibal cult, and then Negan and these kinds of people. I mean, this is what this kind of breakdown would look like. And yet, I kind of thought that after the election, things would kind of settle down and get back to order, but I've actually seen an escalation. Okay, you got Antifa out there. You've got people on the internet, stoking fires where, and yes, it's one thing to put up funny memes. Okay, I do that once in a while. Throw in a funny meme just to kind of make a political point. They're like, today's version of yesterday's political cartoons. But it's not so funny when the meme gets into, again, threats and violence and hoping major harm upon your opponents, regardless of what side it is. I mean, there was one theory, and I don't think it's correct, but there is a theory that that so-called Russian interference in the elections was actually Russians trying to stoke both sides to cause people to, get angry at each other. And I don't know if that's necessarily the case, but it does remind me of an old Star Trek where, you got some Klingons that are beamed up on the ship, and then most of the ship is cordoned off, and then you have an equal number of like 50 Klingons and 50 humans who are being driven to fight and to kill each other, but then they are healed, and then they go at each other again. Sort of like some people talk on the internet about archons and demonic influences that thrive off hate and contention, much like, the character on It, Pennywise, who thrives on fear and survives to a large degree on fear. And, the thing is that when you have this kind of disunity, then suddenly no one's going to start listening to each other. And also the social media that's taking place right now. I'm really angry about how social media is trying to limit communication, because, as some people have called it, it's creating internet ghettos where only people that agree with each other can communicate. I found on one particular social media outlet where I have groups that I manage, that I hardly reach anyone anymore when I put something up. And it's not even a conservative or liberal site, but it still doesn't reach very many people. And I'm not talking about popularity. I'm talking about the reach into, for instance, your friends network or, something like that. And hardly any reach whatsoever. Maybe 2-3%. And that doesn't even tell you how many people actually have engaged themselves in it. And I've heard this from a lot of different sources that, you double and triple and quadruple your followers, and then all of a sudden you're seeing your actual popularity go down. And about the only place people can really interact with each other is within groups. And I think that that's going to change. But I've tried to even share articles, and yes, even from liberal magazines where it's maybe on something like solar energy or something like that, in a discussion, and I get this thing saying, nah, this was not posted because this is spam. And I'm going, how is this spam? It's on someone who is connected to me, and it is pertaining to the issue at hand. And I have a comment and the link, and it's listed as spam. I mean, this is only going to serve, that's going to cause people to get into groups, and then you wind up with people who are already on the left that are going to go more left and maybe become more agitated, and people on the right becoming more right and more agitated. And I am seeing that. I am seeing the level of discourse and what used to be kind of, the social norm breaks within left and right wing. Yeah, I'm on left wing sites and stuff too. And, not that, I'm not saying I'm left wing. I'm just saying that, I try to see what everyone's saying. And they're all going more and more and more radical. And those social norm breaks that used to exist are starting to evaporate on those groups. And so I think ultimately that this is a form of, I think it's a form of censorship personally, but also the people that do hang around, because I should back up a little. I think it's censorship because what I think it may be designed to do is cause feeding frenzies. So, you throw 1,000 people together in a group, and someone puts up something really radical, someone else puts up something saying, well, I don't totally agree with that. And then all of a sudden people are jumping on that person, and then of course, you get fights, and eventually people become disenchanted, cynical, and they leave. Well, I think that's a form of censorship. I think it's a subtle form of censorship that I think is intentional. I may not be, but it sure seems to be. And it will just continue to cause polarization and antagonization. I think some of the election coverage that on these special elections where you see, for instance, a lot of you might have a district that went for Trump by 10, 15, 20%, where a Republican runs and they only win by 5% or somewhere around there. And people think, well, is Trump's popularity going down? Is the person that they had run for the office, are they just not really that charismatic? Or maybe it's because people have gotten burned. You go on to forums and stuff, and you see on the internet where it's constant belittlement and attack and so forth, and you just become like, well, I just don't want any more to do with this anymore. And that can turn into people, suppressing vote in that sense. Now, the left may think, well, that's a great thing. Do you really want a lot of people who feel antagonistic towards whatever the voting outcome might turn into, even if it's to your side? Do you really want a significant percentage of the population antagonistic? Because when they become antagonistic and disenchanted and lose faith in the system, then what? That's when you have societal breakdown. Now, maybe true, a lot of the manners we have, Freud talked about it in Civilization as Discontents, the norms that keep civilization in place, maybe they're artificial, and so forth, I mean, yes, I can see where I'm related to someone and where there's a connection there. Am I really connected to people just because I happen to live in the same country? That's an artificial construct, but it serves a purpose for people to feel that way, because then there's a unity that takes place and a sense of fair play, a sense of caring that can take place. And therefore that keeps the civilization going. And we need to maintain that. We need to continue with that. Because if we lose it, it is not possible to bring it back. You can think of, well, yeah, but there's been wars, like with Japan and so forth, World War II, and they surrendered and things changed over there. Well, that was an outside force coming in. Can you imagine how hard it's going to be for Syria to build itself up once, all the major powers leave and, and the government gets back in order? It's not going to be a stable country for a long time. All right? People have memories. They remember this, that, whatever. You don't want that for the United States. We want to be able to maintain a system where we still have, even though we may have political differences, we do have a shared political foundation, cultural foundation, and so forth, that we still revere and respect. Because once that's gone, once it is gone, then the brakes are off. And then you may as well be, instead of watching The Walking Dead as some sort of entertainment, you may as well watch it as a documentary, because that's what it will be like. And that's not what we want. Now, is it? Anyway, that's all the time we have. And I encourage you to come back next week for another edition of Unlock the Door Radio here on UCY TV Productions. Take care now.